So I've been running offset upper control arm bushings in the front and Megan upper control arms in the rear for quite a few years now. The offset bushings have been great, but the Megan control arms have been less than ideal. Despite my best efforts, the Megan arms always seem to work themselves loose, which is unsettling and surprisingly common. I've been really interested in spherical bushings and have spent many hours researching bushing options for the Honda S2000. I came to the conclusion that if I wanted to retain some adjustability in the upper arms, I would just have to go with aftermarket arms. Coincidentally, FDF Race Shop just released their first products for the Honda S2000 platform, which include a set of front and rear upper control arms. On paper, these arms seem to check the boxes, so I had to get my hands on a set to review. If you're like me, you've probably never heard of FDF Race Shop. They're a company based in Canada that was established in 2015. Their focus is in engineering and manufacturing parts for the drift community, but they do have some grip driving products. These control arms happen to be a passion project of one of their employees that owns a Honda S2000, and they are marketed as for drivers by drivers. The control arms arrived in a sturdy double-walled cardboard box filled with packing peanuts. Included in the box was a link to their installation instructions, 2 pages of your standard legalese absolving FDF of any liability, and some cotter pins. The control arms themselves are wrapped in foam packing with extra care applied to the most vulnerable area, the ball joints. Out of the box, my first impression was that these control arms felt heavy and sturdy, a bit chunkier than the OEM arms. The machining of the heim joint and the spacers was very satisfying with tight tolerances and chamfered edges. Having said that, the defining characteristic of these arms is the method of adjustability. Instead of using the error-prone method employed by many overseas brands like Megan, Trueheart, Hard Race, and K-Tuned, these arms are adjustable on the bushing side as opposed to the ball joint side. The method is most similar to the JDM IKEA control arms or the WiseFab kit, but with more flexibility since the arms can be adjusted without removing anything. The control arms are moved along the rod end of the heim joint by either tightening or loosening the nut sleeve and locking things into place with the jam nut. It's an elegant design that allows you to adjust the camber and even the caster of the alignment if you're into that. On the other end of the control arm, you have a standard replacement ball joint, which brings me to my next point. These control arms appear to be intentionally designed for serviceability and functionality, which embodies the for drivers by drivers mantra. FDF Race Shop sells replacement heim joints, and the ball joints are OEM specs, so any OEM replacement ball joint would work, which is something I can't say about any other control arm on the market. When compared to OEM control arms, the FD arms feel more like a brute force approach to design. The OEM arms are more intricately designed with variations in shape, material thickness, and cross members in what seems like an effort to strike a balance between strength and weight. The FDF arms compromise weight for simplicity and strength with little to no variation in material thickness. Consequently, the FDF front control arms weighed in at 2,014 grams compared to 1,752 grams for the OEM arms. The FDF rear control arms weighed in at 2,184 grams for the AP1 variation and 2,242 grams for the AP2 variation, compared to the 2,038 grams for the OEM AP2 rear arms. Installation of the FDF Race Shop control arms went relatively smoothly. FDF includes both written and video instructions for how to install their control arms, which is better than what most companies do, but their instructions do leave a bit to be desired. The written instructions read like some generalized nonsense generated by ChatGPT. They are only useful for identifying which front control arm is right and which is left. The difference is subtle, and it would be nice if they made it a little bit more idiot-proof by etching an identifier onto the control arms themselves. The video instructions are closer to a complete set of instructions, but they leave out the most important part of the installation, which is how to correctly adjust the arms and how to torque down the adjustment hardware. I reached out to FDF directly, and they told me that the nut sleeve is rated for up to 120 foot-pounds of torque, and that they've been using 100 foot-pounds without issue. I ended up using both shallow and deep 24mm sockets on the nut sleeve and a 24mm wrench on the gem nut to torque things down. Cranking the nut sleeve to 100 foot-pounds was actually pretty tough. The only other thing that bothered me about the install is that the rear arms were designed to accommodate wheel speed sensors while the fronts were not. FDF mentioned that this was an intentional design choice since mounting holes would compromise the strength of the front arms, but could be integrated in a newer version. After torquing things down, I went to get alignment from a local S2000 enthusiast at Type 3 Auto Shop. Chris does appointment-only alignments out of a low-key gas station garage and provides personalized service for track enthusiasts. He let me pick his brain while he worked, and I discovered a few things. The first thing that I noticed is that my wheels were having clearance issues with the front arms at full steering lock, as the clear coat was being ground away into a fine dust on the inside rim. FDF said the arms have been tested with a 17x9 plus 45 wheel, but I'm running a 17x10 plus 48, which are inboard an additional 10mm, so I plan to add a small 3mm spacer to resolve the issue. When I reached out to FDF, they mentioned that they are working on a set of smoother and more low-profile nut sleeves, and also mentioned that they could send out Delrin steering rack limiters, so this may not be an issue for folks in the future. Chris was impressed with the FDF arms and felt that they were easy to adjust while the car was on the rack. Just know that you probably won't be able to fit a torque wrench onto the nut sleeves while on the rack, so you'll still have to remove the wheels to torque things down. One tip that I found interesting is that Chris recommended maxing out the negative camber on the arms prior to getting an alignment, so that the remaining alignment can be handled with the OEM eccentric bolts, which makes a lot of sense. I rolled off the alignment rack with negative 3.5 degrees of camber all around, and that's with the front arms and eccentric bolts completely maxed out and the rear eccentric bolts with some room for adjustment. I didn't do an extensive test drive before throwing sphericals onto the lower arms of the car, but I noticed a subtle increase in road feel through the steering wheel and the seat of the car just driving around the neighborhood. I'd really love to get out on track and provide some deeper driving impressions, but my StopTech C43 big brake kit is broken, and that is a topic for another video. So any impressions on durability will have to wait, but I'm not too worried, honestly. Overall, these control arms are a refreshing addition to the S2000 platform. The rear arms are great as is, and the front control arms could be even better with improved wheel compatibility, additional adjustability, and integrated wheel speed sensor mounts. This is the first iteration of these control arms, and FDF has mentioned several improvements that they have planned, but we'll see if those actually land in the future. Even with their faults, these arms are better than many overseas-made alternatives in so many ways. Instead of being a soulless, white-labeled product, the FDF arms are intentionally and thoughtfully engineered by people who actually care about the Honda S2000 and its quirks. This comes at a slight cost premium, but I'd much rather support ingenuity and craftsmanship than mediocrity. Frankly, I'm just excited that folks are still making new parts for what is a 25-year-old chassis. So if you're in the market for upper control arms, I think these are worth a look.